Hi, everybody. This is Bruce McFarlane. I'm going to now give you the second of the two lectures for week 7 on quality and improvement in education. So I'm going to be sharing the screen with you now to show you the second part of the lecture. Just going to put it up in full screen. Good. Right. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to expand on what I said in the first part of the lecture by moving into the concepts that apply to quality in higher education. If you recall, the first part focused on mainly on the myths and indeed the history of quality assurance systems. So I'm now coming through the presentation and I'm going to be focusing on the second part of it. So just getting to it, here we are. So how do we understand the concepts of quality or the conception of quality? Now, I find one of the ways that's really good to sort of think about it or to start thinking about quality is something as simple as thinking about watches. If I was with all of you in a live situation, I'd probably ask how many of you have more than, should we say, one watch, or how many people own more than 3 watches? And it's quite amazing how many people put their hand up when I ask that kind of question. The question I ask next is, well, why? Why do you have more than one watch? What's the purpose of it? And the explanation tends to be that people use watches for different functions, for different purposes. This brings us to an idea of quality as an idea of fitness for purpose. So the question here I'm asking is, which of these watches is good quality? Well, one might say all of them are, and it depends what you're looking for. If you look at the Mickey Mouse watch, which is one of them that's featured there, obviously that's a great fun watch, maybe very suitable for kids or people with interests in Walt Disney. On the other hand, possibly the Casio watch, which is at the bottom there, which has probably more functions than any of the other watches, is in many ways, you could say, a very, very good quality watch. Ironically, though, it's probably the cheapest of all of the watches as well. Possibly the most, or in fact, definitely the most expensive watch will be the one which appears on the right of the screen, which is the Patek Philippe watch, which is the most expensive brand of watch in the world, more expensive than a Rolex. So that watch is maybe worth even several hundreds of thousands of pounds compared to the Casio, which may be only worth 10, 20, 30 pounds, something like that. And then the watch in the middle, the pink one with the dial, that's also, kind of designer watch. Although my mother used to have a much cheaper version of that kind of thing. And the only reason she wore it was she used to like to wear it when she went out in the evening, maybe to the cinema or the theatre or something occasionally. And she would wear it quite often upside down because, of course, if you look at the dial there, it appears to be saying 10 past 10. But of course, if you wore it upside down, it might be saying, I don't know, 20 to 4 or something like that. She didn't really care because she never actually looked at the time. She was just wearing it almost like a piece of jewelry. So, in thinking about quality, it's very important to remember that actually um, it depends what you're looking for. Lots of things can be considered good or poor quality, depending on the perspective of the person doing the purchasing or the consuming. Now, in terms of higher education, probably one of the most famous attempts to define what we mean by quality in higher education is that offered by Lee Harvey and Diana Green. They were editors of Quality in Higher Education, which is a journal which started in the mid-1990s. This article came out just before. So if you're interested in getting more deeply into this subject, take a look at a journal called Quality in Higher Education. But here, in a very short paper, but a very influential one, they defined what they meant by quality in higher education, and they offered 5 different definitions. Quality is exceptional, perfection, fitness for purpose, value for money, and transformation. So just thinking about those watches for a moment, possibly the one that's really exceptional might be the Patek Philippe, maybe because it's an extremely expensive watch. It's got a lot of Swiss workmanship in terms of its dial function within the case. Quality is perfection. That's more to do with sort of fault-free, not having any kind of faults. And in many respects, in many respects, the Casio watch is very reliable. It's very perfect in the sense that you very rarely find any kind of fault with those watches. They tend to work very reliably. In terms of fitness for purpose, well, of course, that's the point I was trying to make. Some watches you might want to use them for going out in the evening. Others you might want to use a different watch maybe for jogging. One which nowadays would maybe have some kind of a heartbeat monitor or a pace monitor on it. And then you've got to think about value for money. Well, I mean, you can probably buy a watch almost in a pound shop, can't you? On the other hand, much more expensive watches, you've got to ask the question, are they worth the money or not? And then quality is transformation. That's about moving from one state to another. So I haven't explained this yet in terms of higher education, and I'm going to try and do so in the next few slides. So this idea of quality is exceptional. What does that mean? Well, it's taking a very elite view of quality. That's why I mentioned Patek Philippe. In terms of higher education, it might represent the idea that higher education, good quality, is about going to a very high status, high quality institution, such as Oxford or Cambridge. And indeed, these kind of institutions are said to embody quality because they're so famous, because they're very long established, etc. It may, of course, not mean that you're necessarily being taught any better than you might be at a more modest university, or indeed, even some of the research being done isn't necessarily any better, but it has an image, a bit like a very expensive brand. Secondly, we've got perfection. Now, perfection refers to this idea of zero defects, getting it right first time. And from a sort of higher education point of view, you might think of it in terms of not having any complaints, or having great, very effective quality assurance processes. That's what QA means, quality assurance, as I'll come on and explain a little bit later. Then we've got fitness for purpose. Well, fitness for purpose, as I've mentioned, is a very functional view of quality. And you could say in terms of universities, there are some universities that do something a bit different than others, that they are very much the right university to go to for a particular thing. So, for example, the University of the Arts in London is a great place to go if you wanted to become an artist. Indeed, it's the most popular university among Japanese students, for example, in the UK, not just art, but also design and other things in terms of the creative industries. I used to work at City University in London. There are many universities called City University, including a famous one in New York, but there's one in London called City University. And that university has a particular reputation for training for the professions. So, for example, they have a very well-known course on journalism. They have a degree on journalism, which is very, very good, and it leads to jobs in the journalism profession. So, it could be a good place to go if you want that kind of future. So it depends what you want, in other words, fitness for purpose. The second one on this particular slide, the fourth one in terms of their definitions, is value for money. Well, value for money is, I'm sure, something that all of you can understand. It's about offering a good return on investment. And invariably, higher education is nowadays represented in terms of value for money. So when the government talk about higher education, they're often talking about, well, are graduates going to be earning very good money after they pay the tuition fee? So it's a sort of an economic way of looking at it. The amount of money you have to outlay, is it worth it in terms of what you then get back over a whole lifetime? It's not something to do with knowledge as such. It's to do with, well, am I going to benefit economically from my degree? And is it going to lead to a well-paying job? And then finally, we've got transformation. Now, qualities transformation is not something that immediately appears obvious to understand. I suppose it's a more romantic, almost philosophical idea about quality, and one that is maybe quite particular to higher education. And it's about the idea of changing from one state to another, a bit like water becoming ice. So if you think about going to university, you are studying for a master's degree. So you pretty much all have experience of undergraduate studies. If you think about when you started and when you ended, did you become a different person? So quite often I've heard students at degree ceremonies or in celebration events, this whole experience of coming to university has changed me as a person. Now, if somebody says that, that kind of means they've undergone some kind of transformation. It doesn't necessarily mean that the value they got out of their degree was just about getting a good job, or indeed knowing more about economics or sociology or whatever the subject might be. It's about some kind of ontological shift. In other words, what it means to be a person, the sense of personal identity. This experience has changed my life. That is really what is meant by quality as transformation. So one thing I would sort of suggest, but this is very much open to discussion, and I'd like you to think about this for our meeting next week, is stakeholder perspectives. In other words, which of these definitions of quality, where are they coming from? Who do these definitions of quality appeal to? I would suggest, for example, that quality is exceptional tends to be the thing that appeals to the general public. So, to be honest, the general public don't know very much about universities and higher education. And so you tend to find them, they would sort of think of universities in terms of Oxford and Cambridge, maybe one or two others like Imperial and University College London, but they won't have heard particularly of maybe the University of Roehampton, for example. And in the same way, in the United States, they might have heard of some of the Ivy League universities, such as Harvard and indeed Yale and others. But so this is the idea of it being an exceptional quality. And then there's quality as perfection. Well, I suppose this idea of zero defects, trying to ensure there are no mistakes, a bit like a production line. Maybe that's an unfortunate analogy, but in a sense, university managers are running very, very large organizations, multi-million-pound organizations, in effect. It's very important that students get a good experience in terms of, things come back on time, lectures take place on time, coursework is handed back to them, and so on and so forth in a timely fashion. And these are things to do with not having faults. So maybe for the university management, that is important. Fitness for purpose, well, employers are very often quoted as saying, well, university graduates are not being produced sufficiently and appropriately for their particular occupation or profession. So fitness for purpose is a particular concern of employers. Are they learning the things they need to know to start work as a lawyer or to work in marketing or whatever the occupational profession happens to be? Fourthly, quality is value for money. Well, maybe there's lots of other people who are interested in that, but I've suggested the government is particularly interested because the government is often putting a lot of money into the sector. Although it's true that tuition fees are charged, there is still a cost to the taxpayer that is borne to some extent. And in many economies and societies around the world, indeed, there's far more generous government subsidy of higher education than there is in the UK. And finally, quality as transformation is obviously this romantic philosophical idea that you are in some way transformed as a person. And I would suggest that academics, the people who work in universities, like to feel that this is actually what we are achieving with students. It's something which would give people as academics more satisfaction to feel that they are having an impact positively on people's lives. So the question I'd like you to think about is which of these definitions of quality most closely matches with the student perspective. All of you are students. You've been a student before. You are a student again. Which of these, if any, have some resonance for you? Maybe there's more than one, and you might want to give them a weighting. But think about that question. So I'm going to move on now to think about a third myth. If you remember in the first lecture, we did cover a couple of other myths, which I was suggesting, things like the fall in the decline in academic standards being a recent thing, and I was suggesting that's not true. Well, I would also suggest another myth that's not true is that all universities are of the same quality. As you can see here, this is using an article by Moody. You see the references always appear on the slide where I'm referring to people. He identified 4 tiers of universities in the world, World Research Universities, selecting universities, recruiting universities, and vocational institutes. And you can look at the definitions there for yourself. I mean, in the UK, you have the Russell Group, that is a group of elite British universities, about 20 British universities, such as Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, and indeed Bristol University is one of those. The Group of 8 in Australia, places like the University of Melbourne and Sydney. UBC and UT refers to the University of British Columbia and University of Toronto in Canada, and HKU and HKUST in Hong Kong, that refers to the Hong Kong University and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And these are all very highly ranked universities across the world. So to get into these universities is quite difficult, and people who get into them tend to be students who very often have done very well in their qualifications, or indeed have the right the right backgrounds in terms, I say the right backgrounds, the backgrounds that have enabled them to succeed in the education systems that they're in. And so, the idea that the quality of all universities is the same, well, I'm not too sure whether that's really true. Maybe it's a bit of a fiction. It's a bit like saying all football teams are as good as each other. Is the football team that's in the very top division in a country as good as the one that's at the very bottom? It's dubious. But we nonetheless have almost like a kind of collective fiction, I feel, that all of these institutions and universities are of the same quality. Well, quite clearly they can't be. And that's one of the reasons why some people have objected to the idea of a unitary system in the UK, which replaced the binary system. If you look at the very bottom of that tiers, you've got tier 4 vocational institutes, and it says there that 11% of higher education in the UK is conducted in vocational institutes. So to give you some flesh on that, to explain that, a lot of business and management degrees are to some extent taught in further and higher education colleges. Some of the first year, and indeed more than the first year, some of those degrees take place there. So that's what that particular thing refers to. So there are league tables, world rankings of universities, which reflect this different sense of where the quality lies. And so that's another way of thinking about quality. Now, I want to move on to a few concepts which we might discuss further in the seminar, as I was calling it. And I want to give you this model, first of all, called the SERVQual model. Now, the SERVQual model comes, as you can see from the reference at the bottom, from the journal Retailing. And if you have a look on Google Scholar, you'll see it's got 36 or 37,000 citations, which is an absolutely huge number of citations. I think the best cited work that I've got is about 300. So it's enormous, the number of citations. That tells you it's highly influential. And it's been used across business and management studies, in marketing, in lots of areas, including higher education. So this is an example of a concept that has been applied to higher education. And one thing I think is important to think about and evaluate as well, does it work? Can we really apply this kind of concept to higher education? Now, as you can see there are 5 dimensions to this particular idea about service quality. Excuse my various dings going on from my mobile phone. Reliability, responsiveness, assurance, tangibles, and empathy. Now, these things, I'm not going to go into them here in this particular lecture. I would like you to think about these things and see whether you can think of how to apply this, as I've asked in the question, to a higher education context. Just very briefly, I mean, most of them are fairly obvious as to what they mean. Reliability is about, well, are you offering a dependable service or not? Responsiveness, when the customer says, look, I've got a problem, or even in a restaurant, you might put your hand up and say, look, can I have the bill, or can I have some salt or knife and fork? Do you get some kind of response that's reasonably quick? Assurance is about, well, mainly are the people who work in the organization people who help to convey trust and confidence? Do you feel that they are people who know their job, who you feel comfortable with. It's a bit like, if you're being driven in a taxi, do you feel that the taxi driver is a reliable, trustworthy kind of driver? Are they someone you think is going to get you in an accident? Obviously, you hope not. Tangibles, physical facilities, equipment, and appearance of personnel, that's all very important. I mean, for example, when you go into certain settings, you see certain different ways of dressing. So if you go to a hairdressing salon that's very trendy, they might all be wearing black. On the other hand, if you were going to some other kind of situation, such as a restaurant, you might expect the staff to be dressed somewhat differently. And maybe university lecturers, how do you expect us to dress? Well, here we go. I'm not wearing a tie, am I? So you could think about that. Empathy, well, caring, individualized attention. Do you feel that actually anyone cares about you? This is very important in any kind of organization. So think about whether this model could be applied to a higher education context and what examples you might give under those headings. And another thing which I've touched on previously in this shorter lecture is the idea of quality assurance. And I'm just going to explain quality assurance and quality enhancement. So there is an important distinction between quality assurance and quality enhancement. As it says in the definition here, quality assurance is that the customer is satisfied with the overall service quality, that it meets his or her expectation. So that's, if you like, basic requirement. Are you satisfied? Are you happy with with the meal that you've had? Are you happy with your haircut? Are you happy with the way your car has been serviced? On the other hand, there's another idea about quality, which is called quality enhancement, which is about going beyond, should we say, the basic or the more basic idea of trying to meet people's expectations. And that's called quality enhancement. And sometimes the phrase customer delight is used. So, for example, maybe you might meet a situation where somebody sort of gives you an added extra. Maybe if you're going to the hairdresser, they might give you some kind of free kind of hairspray. I mean, obviously, I don't go very often, so I don't have any hair. Or maybe if you're going to a restaurant, they might give you a free drink, or indeed, if it's your birthday, they'll bring some candles or birthday cake, or just something extra that actually makes you feel that they've gone beyond the basics of what you would expect in the first place. So again, can you think of an example of QA, and can you think of an example of QE, quality assurance and quality enhancement, in a higher education context? And then a couple of final things. I mean, one thing to think about is, when can you realistically evaluate quality? And, I think we're largely thinking here about the service context rather than product, producing goods. We're thinking about how customers can potentially experience a product or a service in life. So before you experience something, can you actually evaluate it? Well, very often we tend to nowadays simply cruise around Amazon.com or .co.uk and buy a lot of our goods there, or through purchasing things through websites for lots of products, including supermarkets. But I'll give you a very simple example of a bunch of bananas. If you looked on a market stall at a bunch of bananas, you know enough to be able to evaluate it before you buy it. The reason is that you know that if the bananas are green, they're not ripe. If they're yellow, they're ripe. And if they're sort of a bit black, then they're overripe. Now, you may want overripe bananas, like my grandmother used to love them. You might want to mash them into a banana cake, or indeed you might want underripe ones because you want to keep them for a while. But most people would go for the ripe bananas, which are the yellow ones. So you have some ability to evaluate it because it's a relatively simple product. Secondly, there are products which you can probably evaluate as you experience them. And I think the most obvious one is eating a meal in a restaurant. Do you like the taste? Do you find it satisfying or not? Obviously, there may be consequences if you get a bad stomach, or you feel unwell after you've eaten the meal. But largely speaking, you can evaluate the service as you are experiencing it. But then as products and services become more complicated, it's actually very difficult to evaluate them as you are experiencing them. And here, again, I've given a few examples, like a car repair. I mean, I personally don't know anything about the inside of an engine, but I take my car to be serviced maybe once a year or a bit less than that. And I have no real idea what they're doing. And I just have to trust that they've done it right. And it's only afterwards, when it maybe doesn't break down for a number of months or seems to work perfectly well, that I can feel happy with the service. And in the same way, I've written down there an operation. I mean, if I was to have heart surgery, I certainly wouldn't be able to evaluate what they're doing whilst they're doing it to me. I'd probably be under an anesthetic anyway. And even if I wasn't, I doubt I would understand what they're doing. And hopefully I might feel better and indeed survive after the operation. Then I might be able to evaluate that actually they've done a good job. And finally, in education, can we really evaluate an education, particularly a higher education, as we are experiencing it? I mean, one of the arguments is that there's too much reliance on asking current students like yourselves to evaluate a course until after you've actually experienced it. So maybe in higher education, we should put much more emphasis on alumni, in other words, graduates of programs within universities, to evaluate and to tell us what they think about their experience rather than students who are current. So to give you an example of that, often when students are being assessed, they say that they don't like to do oral presentations, but many alumni or graduates say that it's among the most important things they actually did in their course. So you can have a different perspective having actually fully completed your studies. So what is actually being measured? Well, here I've just got a little simple 2x2 box with quality of teaching, quality of research, because clearly in higher education, you've got both activities going on. And we can think of it in terms of inputs and outputs. So I've given some examples of the various things being used as evaluative tools. So teaching observations as an input into terms of the quality of teaching. In other words, as people are teaching, you occasionally get people who observe you teach. They might be a colleague. Exceptionally, they might be someone coming to review the quality of your teaching. And clearly that's happening as you are actually doing it. But then most things to do with the quality of teaching are all about the output. In other words, first of all, do you retain students? Do students drop out? Do they get bored with what you're doing? Do they feel inspired by what you're doing, hopefully? Degree results. Are students getting good degrees? Of course, universities award those degrees themselves. So some people say, well, that's a contentious issue as to whether that really represents high quality. Graduate employment. Are students getting jobs? Are employers satisfied through survey data and things like that? So there's many ways you could try, and indeed they are evaluating the quality of teaching. And if you look at the quality of research, one of the input measures is research grants. So, how many hundreds of £1,000s or millions of pounds are you generating as a researcher? So this applies to many people working in Bristol University, including myself, as a research active professor. And then also the output end is publications and patents. If let's say you are a scientist or an someone who's around the invention side, or copyright. I mean, things which are going to generate what's called intellectual property. So some of these things, and something you could add to that list, which I only just thought about, which is quite true, is impact. The quality of the impact of research is now being evaluated as well through the research excellence framework, which I mentioned in the previous lecture. So to summarize and to give you a conclusion for these two talks, I would say, first of all, the history of quality assurance is very important to understand something about it. It stretches back a long way. It's not really a recent thing, but clearly the emphasis on quality assurance has been ramped up, and it was never called quality assurance. It was really about academic self-governance or managing our own kind of estate rather than the government becoming involved in quality assurance as it has done since the 1960s. traditions of academic self-governance mean that universities and particularly academics do have what I've called ambiguous attitudes to QA, to quality assurance, often quite defensive attitudes, I would argue. This is sometimes because people feel that that there is a lack of trust, or should we say, in academics as professional people. But this is a feeling that you will find in many other walks of life as well. Much of the QA and HE literature has been derived by applying those concepts from service management and marketing. So, if you look at a lot of literature around service management, quite a lot of those ideas, I haven't even mentioned all of them, have been applied in various articles and research to higher education. And finally, it's important to remember that quality as a term is really quite an elusive and disputed concept. This is why some people might think of quality as transformation, others might think of it as value for money. What is being evaluated is a complex professional service, and therefore who really has the knowledge to be able to evaluate it properly. So that really now concludes the lecture that I'm giving, and this week. Thank you very much indeed for watching this video. I'm now going to attempt to turn things off, and I'd like to say thank you again for you doing this. I'm really looking forward also to being able to meet all of you soon. Okay, cheerio then. Bye for now.